Hey, Matthew here. Just a quick introduction before we get to the conversation, just to give some context around it. When I was in the process of creating this new series I'm working on, Warriors of Leitmotif, which is about the use of musical themes and leitmotif throughout the Final Fantasy series, I thought it would be a good idea to talk to someone who was a little bit more in the know about this kind of stuff. And really the only person that came to mind was Sideways. Sideways is a YouTube channel that discusses music, usually within the context of film scores, but also has a few videos on video game music, and he talks a fair bit about the use of leitmotif. I would describe him as a scholar of music. He knows a ridiculous amount about the history of music and how it has essentially evolved to become what it is now. It was an absolute no-brainer that it would be amazingly beneficial to talk to him, and luckily he agreed to chat. Originally, I had this idea of potentially using the conversation in the actual episode and kind of like cutting between it. So I recorded the whole thing. But unfortunately, that didn't work out in the final shape that the video needed to take. But it was still a really insightful conversation that informed the direction of the video. So I thought it would be worthwhile sharing that conversation that we had. I thought his answers were really interesting to the questions. So here it is, and apologies for the quality. Sometimes it cuts off the very first part of his sentence because of the crappy internet connection I had, but generally you can fill in the blanks. All right, enjoy. Hey, thanks so much for doing this.
Oh, don't worry about it.
Really appreciate it. So I know I've clarified this like a million times, but I just do want to confirm like what it's kind of about, what this is about. So starting the new series, it's about the use of theme and leitmotif in the Final Fantasy series. And so I'm just going like game by game through each game and looking at its themes. It's a lot of work. It's going to be a lot of work, but it's
a lot of work.
Yeah, and
because really you're looking at all of Uematsu's work. You're not just looking at like a game series, you know?
Yeah, exactly. And then going into other people's work as well. Sure. But I am just gonna, like, the first episode I'm doing like all of the NES titles in one because he didn't really use that much leitmotif in the first three. And so basically in this first episode, what I want to do is more just like introduce the topic and talk a little about how, like, you know, leitmotif is this old storytelling technique that's used.
It's a really weird story behind what leitmotif is and how it works. Yeah.
Do you wanna voice that story?
Can try.
Very briefly, like
my exact like history and origin of the word leitmotif I haven't been able to find. And one of the things you got to clarify is talking about Wagner is always kind of icky because Wagner was like a really terrible person.
Yeah. Oh yeah, totally.
Philosophers who like talk about his works, like when I say philosophers, I mean like philosophy students who are like in their undergrad, and how Wagner had this belief that like your like ethnicity or your national identity or something was like critical to how you perceive music or something like that. I don't know. It's really racist. It's really awful. Which is a shame that he kind of and went with it harder than like anybody else that had ever had. I talk about him no matter what because nobody's really done it the way that he did and as well as he did it, which is like unfortunate, honestly. If you want to try and trace like where a leitmotif comes from, you got to go back to Beethoven. Really, people around Beethoven and during that time had there's this technique called motto theme, and with a motto theme you're basically repeating the same idea in like a symphonic work to kind of emphasize an idea. So I think like Ode to Joy would be a good example of that, if I'm not mistaken, or Ode to the line ya da 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 appear in bits and pieces throughout the symphonic work. Then you move on to Hector Berlioz with Symphonie Fantastique and an idée fixe, which is French for fixed idea, which is basically the same thing. The whole point about the Symphonie Fantastique, though, is that it's a program piece, right? He's telling a story about this artist who goes on like an opium trip or something, and then he thinks he dies or whatever. But the whole idea is that he's got this like romantic fascination with this person, and that person is represented by this one repeated idea. And then after Hector Berlioz, you have Franz Liszt, who was like a big piano guy, and he would write these symphonic poems. And the whole idea behind these symphonic poems was he was taking these literary works and he was turning them into an instrumental orchestral piece of music, which are It's really cool to sit down and listen to. From like those kind of bunny hopping points, those like markers in history, you can kind of see this idea of what Wagner was doing with Leitmotif and like ascribing music to a story or something like that.
But he's the one who kind of went with it and just ran with it.
Yeah,
and like doubled down on that idea.
Right, because Wagner never actually called it Leitmotif.
No.
It was one of his critics, right? Like or like some music theorist out there who called them leitmotifs or leading motifs. Wagner believed in Gesamtkunstwerk, which is a wonderful giant word.
Amazing. God bless you.
No, but Gesamtkunstwerk was total artwork, and the idea was that like Wagner was this like horrible control freak, and he would
That's true.
He would command every aspect of his operas. So like he wrote the libretto, he wrote the story, he wrote the music. He was like, I heard stories about him like micromanaging costumes and the set and this and that. And thinking about that nowadays, like nobody could ever do that. But Wagner was so popular during his time that he had private investors just paying his rent.
Wow.
So they would just like pay his rent, and they would pay for like all of his everything. And it took him like 21 years to write the Ring Cycle, all like umpteen hours of it. Yeah, so that's how he got away with it. Was like, well, I'm not paying for this shit. I'll just do whatever the hell I want.
Yeah, right.
And so that's kind of like how Leitmotif, from like a Wagnerian perspective, came to be. At least from the way that I've read.
And this is more out of curiosity's sake. But in a modern context, the one person we kind of consider when talking about Leitmotif is John Williams. Was he was that chain of influence like directly from Wagner, do you think, or?
Yeah, and the missing link is Erich Wolfgang Korngold.
Okay.
There's a direct bridge here. It's really strange to kind of see it unfold the way that it did. I have a video on Korngold. I think it's my Robin Hood one on like how to transform a leitmotif or something like that.
Yeah.
So basically, Wagner existed at the end of the 19th century, and so in the turn of the century, you had the World Wars, and it was this like I keep bringing up the World Wars in like my videos, but it was like this unprecedented like destruction, almost like suicide of culture.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? Europe back in the 1900s, and this is like a really terrible way of looking at it, but Europe thought that it was like the apex of civilization. Oh, we had built all this, and this is amazing. And they had these massive colonial empires that were like horrifically damaging to the rest of the planet, but everyone was like, no, look at how amazing Europe is. And it's like, they're not all that. Anyway, a lot of like socio-political and cultural elements of it, like being in America and living in America, like people will travel to Europe. Like they're going to this mythical, like they're going to Middle Earth, you know, or something like that.
Ancient
or like
Greece,
to like New Zealand. And that all comes from that like colonial time period. The sun never sets on the British Empire kind of thing. And so with the World Wars, this quote unquote high society bombed itself to smithereens. So if you have this like super high and mighty culture bombing itself to smithereens, all of a sudden this deification, this godhood, this immaculate civilization, it's suddenly like, well, hang on, they're not all that. Like they're not tough shit. They just blew themselves up. How smart could they have been? And culturally that happened. And so there's this massive cultural disrupt right around like the World Wars, where like looking at this like common practice period classic Western musical system just vanishes almost.
Right.
50s and 60s, you start seeing the rise of atonality and serialism. Right, we go Stravinsky. Wow, Stravinsky went from the Rite of Spring to basically writing atonal serialism, 12-tone technique, from Arnold Schoenberg. And Schoenberg and the rise of serialism kind of came about in the post-World War II era. But one of the other aspects of World War II was this massive exigence of people from Europe to all over the planet, a lot of whom went to America because America wasn't like directly physically damaged, save Pearl Harbor, from all of the wars, right? So like trying to rebuild infrastructure in Europe put all of Europe at a massive disadvantage when it came to like the global economy, which meant that people were leaving and going to New York and LA and all over America to try and like seek their fortune almost. One of those people was Erich Wolfgang Korngold, who was an Austrian who a lot of people, or I've read people, or I read at least one account who said that he was like the new Mozart. He was this musical genius, like the savant and this prodigy, and he was amazing. When you think of the old 1930s, 1940s, the adventures of Robin Hood, Hollywood sound, that was Erich Wolfgang Korngold.
Right.
he used a lot of leitmotif in his music. That's one of the reasons why I really, really love The Adventures of Robin Hood. Is like, it's like, wow, there's so much like little details in here. Like every time they shoot an arrow, you hear a harp gliss.
Oh, wow. Yeah, cool.
Kind of like a video game sound effect almost, but 100 years, or I guess 70-ish years before you'd actually hear it in like an actual video game.
Yeah, and that kind of leads on into what we're actually kind of talking about. And I think some people have big sort of misconceptions about what leitmotif is. I have this video on my channel about Undertale soundtrack.
Okay.
And I talk very briefly about leitmotif because because that soundtrack is just full of it. But also a lot of he just references tracks, in strange sort of ways, not necessarily taking melodies and reshaping them or like making them bigger or that sort of thing. But, he might, take a sound effect and then slow it right down and then make that into an ambient piece of music. And, I said, there are 8 tracks or whatever in the entire soundtrack that don't have some sort of like leitmotif in them. And they were like, this ambient track is actually this other track. And I'm like, well, is that leitmotif? I don't know. I don't think so, but maybe it is.
It's difficult to try and motif because and this is kind of where you turn into sort of like an elitist D-bag almost. Because you kind of have to do it because leitmotif has been readapted throughout the years. Term leitmotif, like originally, when it comes to Wagner, leitmotif is like these small passages, like these very, very small fragmentary ideas.
Yeah.
Like John Williams, and you want to break down a leitmotif, you tend to think of an entire theme, an entire complete musical idea, or even an entire piece of music, right? Superman, Star Wars, Indiana Jones, you like immediately have an idea of what the main theme to the entire film is. And that really comes from radio. Back when there were radio shows, in order to kind of discern that there was a show, the new show had started, they would have a theme song to let everybody know that the show was starting.
Right.
Like television, with television you could just see what the show is, but with radio they had to have a theme song to kind of be like, hey, show's starting, this is what it is.
Yeah.
And so nowadays when people think of leitmotif, they kind of conflate that term with theme music. Yes. Which is sort of how people process it nowadays. It's like leitmotif is theme music, they're one and the same. For Final Fantasy, Eris's theme is her leitmotif. And like, nowadays, sure. But if you want to look at this from like, a Wagnerian sense, let me look down at you, like turning into kind of a D-bag, it's like, from a Wagnerian perspective, that's very blunt.
Yes. Because
looking at this
Eris theme, not Eris leitmotif. A leitmotif encompasses a much more sort of thing, because flowers blooming in the church has Eris theme in it. And so that is when you start getting into leitmotif territory from my understanding of it. Let's slow down a touch.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you, how do you define leitmotif? What is your definition of leitmotif?
Oh, it really depends on who I'm talking to. For all of my videos, just for like I'll say that it's a piece of music associated with a person, place, or thing, like a noun, in a story of some kind. But when I'm like talking to somebody who's like listened to Wagner and studied Wagner, I think leitmotif becomes more of like how the music tells a story in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
Is associated with the story and helps tell that story in its own unique and musical way.
Right, okay, sure. So for you, that the idea of leitmotif isn't necessarily limited by certain things like its length or that it's recurring or something like that. It's more just like how the music tells the story.
Yeah, I would say something more like that. I would honestly, when it comes to just of audience, right, like who's listening to it and where the efficacy of a leitmotif comes from, right? If a leitmotif is supposed to help the audience understand the story, then the audience needs to understand the leitmotif. like I've got a video on how the instruments in Steven Universe represent the characters, and I keep seeing comments of people who are like, I've watched this show so many times and I've never noticed that. So like if you like in something like that, it's like, okay, well the music is helping tell the story, but people aren't picking up on it. How effective is it?
Yeah, and that's kind of one of the things that I want to explore as well. I'm kind of using a very sort of basic definition in this first episode, at least, to kind of flesh out what is and what isn't a leitmotif, just so we're all on the same page, and like it's got to be recognizable, at least. Like it doesn't have to be like, you know, incredibly complicated melody that's like unmistakable, but it at least has to be recognizable to the audience.
Recognizable is like the best way to put it, because if your audience can't get it, then it kind of falls apart, you know?
Yeah, which is this whole Undertale thing where it's like, yeah, like he manipulates, you know, maybe he manipulates this thing to the point where you don't even realize it, but technically it's that. Is that a leitmotif? I don't know.
The thing,
like, it's not serving a purpose.
The thing for me when it comes to leitmotif is that you're never really talking about something objective, because it is an art, because it is music. A leitmotif, really, you're kind of forming an argument. I think this music is ascribed to this thing because XYZ. So like in Star Wars, you hear the Force theme every time they're using the Force. You know, it's like, well, I think this music represents the Force because we hear it whenever they're talking about the Force, using the Force or something like that. So when it comes to something explicitly like Undertale, big problem with people's interpretation or their analysis, because some of it feels... I don't feel comfortable really criticizing Undertale because it was like one person, and I don't have any like massive body of work that can be like reciprocated or I don't know. Okay, that could also be criticized by somebody, you know. Also, it feels like kind of a dick move to just like criticize it. But because it's such a massively influential like work, you kind of have to talk about it. But there's one theme. It's it's the fish chick with the spear.
Undyne.
So that character has that theme.
Yeah.
Right? Very cool. Okay. It's this weird like flamenco kind of thing, like it's in West Side Story. America, America, something America, something America, right? Very cool. Like it's a flamenco dance. All right, neat. A lot of battle themes kind of have that kind of vibe to them. That's
sort
cool.
of dancey. Yeah.
That is also the music that plays in the tutorial.
Right. Why?
It's also the music that plays in the tutorial. It's also the music that plays in like the ruins, right? And so,
oh my god, it is.
So if you're gonna have that music, people say like, oh, this is leitmotif because we hear it in the ruins and we hear it in the tutorial. Oh, and we hear it for this boss fight.
But it doesn't make sense.
It's like, okay, but like narratively speaking, what the fuck are you talking about?
Yeah.
Right? Like, is this character like the guardian of the ruins? Did this character walk you through the tutorial? Like, what the shit are you talking about?
Yeah, see, if it was Toriel's theme, it would make a lot more sense because that's kind of her area and she walks you through it. But
yeah, and I have no idea who that is, but yeah, you're right. Like, you know, there are these connections that are either narratively meaningless or counterintuitive to what it seems like the game is trying to say.
Just confusing.
So like just because the music repeats or just because a noticeable part of the music comes back kind of makes me think that it was one dude working on it on his own and he just didn't have the time to write new themes all the time. And it's really unfortunate, and it's kind of been like a really frustrating endeavor every time I've tried to like tweet about Undertale or like make a video or like even talk about one aspect of Undertale, because like the Megalovania theme problem with that entire work, but at the same time it's like it's the flagship of the entire game. But yeah, that's kind of exactly what I'm talking about. It's like, okay, so hold on. Very happy that thousands of you are excited about this, but can somebody please explain to me how these are connected? Because the other problem is I've never played the game.
Yeah, right.
So she might be like from the ruins and there's like some sort of lore reason behind it, but I've just never found it.
I don't believe so. I don't think she's got anything to do with that area. But yeah, to me it's just confusing, and that's again something that I'm going to kind of be talking about in the series. I don't want to just talk about how it does it well and stuff. I want to talk about how it does it poorly. So like the one example that I can think of at the moment is, or that I know of already, like Final Fantasy X. I don't know if you've played it. You have? So you've got, you know, Sateki Dane, which is the main theme of the thing. Like,
Yes,
Titus
yeah.
and Yuna share their kiss. So it's kind of like, you know,
Sex scene, but it's PG-13. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. But then that is Yuna's theme, right? It's the same melody. And so to me, that kind of makes it, that moment, a lot more about Yuna than about them as a couple.
That is a. Have you seen my Wonder Woman video?
Yeah, I think I have. I think it's been a while though. I can't really remember.
If you see my Wonder Woman video, that might help you with that specific problem. But that's more of like a gender issue.
Yeah, and the fact that, yeah, I don't know, but like it kind of goes further because, you know, there's the Zanakin theme, which, you know, would link really well with Titus, but that's more about the journey more than anything.
Yeah.
And Titus has his own separate theme. But then Yuna's theme / Sateki Dane is used as an area theme for Kilika. And
Exactly.
like, what's that got to do with anything? Like, yeah, Yuna performs the sending there, but like, that's about it. They just pass through it and Sin attacks it. And
Well, that's kind of like another massive narrative problem that I see a lot in Japanese media. You see the meme every once in a while where it's like, you're the villain, but you hear the main theme, right? It's like, okay, like when you hear the main theme to the show, the bad guy's about to die, right? That's the meme that you see all over Reddit and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's like, okay, narratively speaking, what does that mean, right?
so that's sort of like another question that I want to ask is about like, you know, the association that themes have to elements. How stringent do you think it has to be, or how like strongly connected does it have to be to a physical thing? First of all, let's just talk about like physical objects.
It depends on, comes down to an argument, but really it comes down to your audience, right? If you're trying to write something really like esoteric and out there, it doesn't matter so long as you like the way it sounds. But if you're trying to write something that's going to be popular and that a lot of people who have a North American music education are going to be listening to, then you need to kind of beat them over the head with a soundtrack, right? There's a reason that Star Wars sounds the exact same way for every Star Wars that's like in the main series, you know?
I think music can't afford to be subtle if it wants to be effective a lot of the time.
I mean, it can't afford
soundtracks.
Soundtracks can't afford to be subtle if they want to be popular.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Good point.
I think that's a good way to put it.
So like I'm thinking along the lines of like main themes. We're talking about them earlier as like kind of, you know, being used to introduce something. But you've got like, say, the main theme of Final Fantasy that, you know, every single game it pops back up in some sort of way.
Which isn't the prelude. I just watched your video on that, yeah.
Oh, right. Yeah, it's not the prelude. There's a separate theme. That one also pops up every single time, and I'll be talking about that a little bit because the prelude is technically the crystal theme.
Right.
So every time there's crystals in the game, that theme pops up, but it's also, you know, the prelude. It's used to introduce the story.
That's what most people associate with Final Fantasy, yeah.
Yeah. And so it kind of also represents this idea of like, you know, a new beginning or a new adventure or something like that.
Sure.
So that sort of has a dual purpose. But the main theme, it doesn't really represent anything apart from Final Fantasy. Is that Leitmotif? I don't know. Like, can you represent the series?
That's kind of like the question, right? It's intended purpose, and then how is it used well? You know, like if the main theme is I'm going to play a piece of music at the beginning of the movie, exists based off of its own invented or its own created validity, right? Like if you watch the Star Wars prequels, the main theme doesn't show up anywhere. And this is something I talked about in my Rey's theme video, where in the original trilogy for Star Wars, the main theme started as Luke's theme, right?
Yes.
But then as the trilogy unfolds, it's kind of like, okay, it's more like the main theme to Star Wars, but it's still kind of Luke's theme, but the story's about Luke, so it's okay.
Yeah.
Prequels, and this is what I mentioned in that video, like you hear the main theme at the opening of the movie, and then you maybe hear it once or twice throughout the whole prequel trilogy because Luke's not there.
Right. So
it doesn't make any sense. And so now the Star Wars theme is just like the Star Wars theme by the nature of being the Star Wars theme, and now Luke's dead. So, yay.
So we're not getting that theme anymore.
Or we are, you know?
Yeah,
so
we're
now
totally
it's
going
kind
to.
of
Of course we are.
it's completely anachronistic now to have the main theme play for episode 9, but it's going to happen. So.
Of course. So I want to talk about like variation and like theme and variation as well, because we're saying that it gets confused a lot with leitmotif, but what sort of makes that difference? Because, you know, a lot of tracks in Final Fantasy, in Undertale, they will just basically take the entire track and just have a different arrangement of it. And it'll just be the exact same theme. And people will be like, what a great leitmotif. And I'm like, is that leitmotif? Like, it's, I guess as long as it's serving the purpose of the story, and bringing something new to that idea, or that I guess that melodic idea, or that theme that represents the character or the story in some way, like, sure, I guess.
It comes back down to audience. It sucks that this is kind of like the answer, but it's also sort of the conundrum of like music education nowadays, and how like people aren't getting music degrees, and how music programs are getting like losing funding, and they're getting smaller and smaller because people don't see the value of it. Because what it turns into is, if I can't recognize it, then it does not carry its intended value as a musical technique, right?
It becomes an Easter egg.
Becomes an Easter egg. You see it on the movie details subreddit instead of it actually being like a fantastic like addition to the story itself. Yeah. So so the thing is like a really, really generic way of doing this will be like, okay, so you have a main character's theme. It's an entire piece of music, and the character's happy, so it's a happy theme. It's in major. Well, now I'm going to turn the theme into minor because, oh no, his dog just died. The audience going to pick up on what you just did. Might just have to like copy and paste it and then just slow it down, and that'll be the absolute limit of what a lot of people will be able to hear and understand on like a first, second, or even third playthrough.
Yeah. But then also there's the question of, a lot of this happens subconsciously. Like, music is emotional, and, you know, they might not recognize it as the same sort of theme but turned into a minor chord or something, but they will recognize that that was a more joyful sort of sounding theme that they had, or maybe they're just a general feeling of happiness in this scene, and now this is a mournful sort of theme or scene.
That is completely true. But if you think about how effective something like Star Wars or Superman is, there's very little variation on the themes. Watching Superman or watching Star Wars, there are very few times when I'm like, oh, hey, if you listen to that a couple times, you can actually tell that's this theme, but upside down and backwards, and you know, in a different key signature, and it modulates 7 times halfway through. You know, as compared to like, oh, that's clearly Superman's theme, but it's slower, it's in the lower register, it hasn't modulated, or if it has, it's very slight, and you can kind of tell like, oh, that's a very slow, somber Superman march. He's sad that something just happened. Yeah. You know, I can't think of a scene where that actually happens, but that's kind of like what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. It does come down to how the audience perceives it. The further and further you go away from that sort of recognizable theme, the less effective, essentially, it's going to be, because it's not going to be picked up on.
Exactly. You know, so because like when you think of Aerith's theme, right, and this is kind of going back to Final Fantasy VII, which is what I know. Yeah. When Aerith dies, right, it is her theme, and like I think it's even the exact same arrangement. It's just they just hit play on the track.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
That's what makes it so effective to so many people.
But I believe,
you know, you think of,
sorry, this is the like, you know, I'm going to go through the game and play through it and like write down every single track that plays and when it plays, and then I'm like going through the soundtrack and finding all, like digging out all the motifs and like linking them all to find out. But I think that's the only time Aerith's theme plays, or it's the first time that Aerith's theme, the track, plays.
No, and you hear it. You hear it when Cloud first meets Aerith at the church.
No, you don't. You hear flowers blooming in the church, which is Aerith's theme. But it's a different arrangement. But it's a different arrangement because this is what I believe. This is what I believe, and this is why I'm going to go through and play it and check. Because if you played Aerith's theme right there, you'd be like, "This is strange. This is very sad. Like, this is a heartbreaking track." And maybe that like might even spoil for you the fate of Aerith. And
maybe if you're able to read it that hard, yeah.
Yeah. And because it's a heartbreaking piece. So by utilizing a different arrangement, it can kind of hide that, I guess, or like be more scene appropriate, essentially.
But the different arrangements and how your leitmotifs are utilized in the arrangement directly correlates to who you're talking to and why. Like if I add like 4 on the Floor and I sidechain it and it's Eris's theme, but it's all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, it's Eris at a club. She's at a party.
Yeah.
Right. But if it's just like solo flute, then it's, oh, maybe it's Eris is sitting on a balcony somewhere by herself hanging out.
Yeah.
Going to be like some cultural signifiers or cultural like pickups that you have to have with your audience and understanding your audience. And so that's what kind of comes back to the audience recognition thing, is that if they can recognize the leitmotif within the context of the arrangement, then it's going to make more sense to them.
Exactly.
And that arrangement kind of situation, that's like case in point. If it sounds really, really sad like it does when she dies, then that will tip off people who are tuned in to the same frequency that Uematsu was.
Yeah.
Like, that's like a perfect example.
So speaking on that, I do want to get into how leitmotif is very unique in games, because obviously games are like this modern medium that offer this like experience, this interactive experience that no other medium sort of has before, and that has implications with its music, which you have talked about before with like repetition and loops and that sort of thing, and dynamic music and whatnot.
Sure.
But also like story implications, like you play this playable character, so you have a story that kind of evolves like on a micro level down to your individual actions. So if you go out and you fight this enemy and it turned out to be really tough, you need to go back to town and heal up. That's part of the story, right? Technically, like
that's a part of your story.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you're talking about like a linear, like a film, right, which is like explicitly a linear experience, basically, you can plan exactly like where the hit is, when you get healed. You can write a whole cue based on him crawling through the desert back to the town to try and get healed up.
Yeah, but with the game, it's just like, here's this like puppy little like world map theme, as they're like scrambling back to the town. But what you start in that town and the town music plays, and so you've got a theme that's very associated with that town music, with that town. So it's that town's leitmotif, as people would put it. But then later in the story, you come back to that town, and that same music plays. But it's not. It doesn't change at all. It's the exact same cue. It's the exact same track. But in the course of the story, you've returned to that place multiple times, and you have that association with that same musical sort of theme.
Right, and so you hear this chipper town theme, even though you're like on the verge of death.
Yeah. There is a bit of disconnect there, but like it's using that same sort of leitmotif principle of like having different part of the story like associated with this sort of musical theme in the same sort of context. Does there have to be an implicit sort of like variation in it and talk more to the actual what's happening in order to get some sort of story across?
When I think of that, you can immediately think of a bunch of possibilities, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of more of a game design principle in that every time... I'm sorry, can you hear my heater going on right now?
No, you're good.
Okay.
I'm sweating like a pig here, so...
No, we just had a freak snowstorm this morning, so yeah,
right.
Different hemispheres.
We're in a heat wave, so...
I read about that. I saw a dude cooking kangaroo meat on his floor. Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
That's just
normal. Yep. Sunday.
Yep. That question really comes down to more of like a game design concern, which is when you design a game, you have to anticipate single possible choice a player can make, and then like manufacture a game that will leave them making choices that you can then subsequently predict, right?
Yeah.
So like if the character like goes out, fights, comes back, heals, he then has to either go back out and fight, or he has to go out and grind, or he just sit in the town and waste his life,
Be like, that was too hard. I'm not doing that.
Yeah, exactly. Like, this is Dark Souls. Forget it. I'm just gonna sit on my Steam library. every single one of those options and those paths have their own branching paths. And so when you look at like the greatest example of that is like the Stanley Parable, where it's just you make a binary choice and then you go down a path, and then you make a binary choice and you go down a path, and you make a binary choice and go down a path. But when you look at the Stanley Parable, there are dozens and dozens and dozens of choices, and each one of them would have to have something musical in order to have it work. And one of the limitations of music is like having to make it. It is fundamentally temporal. So in making music and writing music, there's this time is the canvas on which you paint music. It's a quote I remember hearing, and I put it on my videos every once in a while.
And then I saw that, and the commenters, one time you're like, I don't know who said it, and all the commenters were like, that was you.
Oh, yeah, that's me. Okay. Faster. Anyway, so thing is like when it comes to kind of like doing it, it's an insane time investment.
Yeah.
Games have this massive time investment kind of built in. Some games can take an hour. I just watched Bomber Guy finish Donkey Kong in like 57 hours, was it?
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
Think about it. That was effectively, I know it was a quote-unquote speed run. That was effectively like a 57-hour playthrough of the game. For him, lasted 57 hours. Okay? Now let's say we wanted to make a game like that. That's our game that we have to score. And we're going to score it with the same level of complexity that Wagner did. Right? It took Wagner 21 years to write 14 hours of music.
Yeah.
It would take him 100 years working nonstop to score that playthrough experience of Donkey Kong 64 if you were going to hold it up to that caliber. That's kind of why I made that video, where it's like there is this natural difficulty with scoring video games in that I can never predict when you're going to press A, right? When you turn on a video game, you never have to press start, and I have to account for that temporally speaking, which is like that's the game scoring paradox right there.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why, we can rag on Toby Fox for using the leitmotif in a sort of way that doesn't make sense. But, for his own sanity or something, sometimes, like, just reusing those themes is just what's going to, like, have to happen, essentially, because...
Absolutely. Because he still wrote, like, an hour and a half of music,
right?
It's
still a massive soundtrack, yeah, and it's a great soundtrack.
Proportionally speaking to the game, there's way more music than for standard games. I think there's some Final Fantasies that have an hour's worth of music, and Undertale's only, 5 hours?
Yeah, I mean, you got multiple playthroughs, and like they introduce new themes, like new music tracks and that sort of stuff as well. Undertale's a complicated game, structurally, I guess.
Right, because that's the other thing that makes it that much more impressive for what he did, is that there's all those branching paths, and he has scored them.
Yes,
like if you, I'm an alien to this game, but if you start killing people, the music changes.
Yep, exactly. Yep.
Like hidden bosses or something like that. There are certain conversations that are completely elective. You don't have to have these conversations with characters, but when you do, there's a whole cutscene, and there's music to that, and it's scored, and it's like that's a lot of work to do.
And also, Toby, he is a musician. That's why he can write some pretty great music.
Isn't that how he got his like background? Like he was doing Homestuck and stuff like that.
Yeah. And mother like fan games and that sort of stuff, I think. But the way he kind of prepared scenes and thought about scenes was that he'd actually write the music first. And then like the scene would kind of evolve from that.
So like that's an interesting prospect, because if he wrote the Ruins theme and then used that for the tutorial follows the Ruins theme, and then when he fights the character,
Undyne,
that is the same idea as well. So it's kind of like three interpretations of the same piece of music from a game design perspective.
Yeah.
It's really interesting to look at.
I suppose we're almost done, but I did want to talk about like your like you had that video that's literally, if you type in leitmotif, it's like the top result is your video on theme versus leitmotif.
That's where I tried to talk about like, hey, they're kind of not the same.
Yeah. So I just wanted to like briefly sort of touch on that, I guess, because as I was saying, like theme and variation, like you can just take an entire track and morph it into something else, or entire theme and just morph it into something else. But do you think it's necessary for it to be like, you know, a short little phrase that can, like, you know, its most concise version of it in order to be a leitmotif? Or do you think, like, yeah, sure, like, you know, theme and variation, it's a type of leitmotif?
I think it's a part of what leitmotif, like, it's kind of a cop-out answer, but I think it really comes down to what leitmotif means to you.
Sure.
Because it has changed so many times throughout history that really you have to identify it for what you're going to do and how your system works. In video games, you have to loop music. That's just something that has to happen. And so in trying to have something that is a motif and not a theme is damn near impossible. But if you have an entire theme and you can use that theme in different ways depending on the different circumstances, it will loop cleanly and it'll work, like what you see in Undertale, which, again, great example. And so when you talk about theme and variations, can that be a leitmotif? Sure, right? Because people look at Superman and they call that a leitmotif. Or they look at Star Wars and they call the main theme to Star Wars a leitmotif. I do. And then to that end, you can argue that Who Lives in a Pineapple Under the Sea, and that whole theme is the leitmotif that represents the TV show SpongeBob. So
I think ultimately definitions don't really matter. It's about public perception about what it actually is.
Definition is really difficult. Defining a leitmotif is very hard to do because it's changed, sort of. But really what it comes down to is it's music that represents something in a story. It's up to the composer to really figure out what that means to them and then to have that connection with their audience.
Beautiful. That is a beautiful way to end, I think.
There we go. We can put that in the video.
That can definitely go in. Because yeah, a lot of the video is just about defining what a leitmotif is, and a lot of me is just being like, but is it? I don't know. Like, does it have to be?
Yeah,
so I think
it's like this, but then it's not, and it's like this, but then it's not.
But then who cares, really? Because, like, as long as it's getting the point across, then, like, it doesn't matter if it's a leitmotif or not. Like, yeah. That's a good sort of, like, you know, way to end. I appreciate this. I really appreciate you having this conversation with me.
Yeah, no worries.
Is there anything else that you kind of wanted to say, or any other thoughts?
No. I really enjoyed this. This was a lot of fun. Thanks for thinking of me when you thought, I'm going to talk about leitmotifs.
You are the guy. You are the leitmotif guy.
That's what everybody says. Like, you're the leitmotif guy. Like, all right, that's cool. I'll do that.
I think it's interesting because people find it so interesting. Like, every time I've talked about leitmotif, people have gone wild about it. And I'm like, yeah. It's cool. It is cool. But I think it's just something that people can kind of understand in a very, like, physical sort of way. Like, they can recognize that. It's one of those, like, you know, you can't unsee it sort of things, or can't unhear it.
It's like visceral. It's like a visceral. It's like, oh yeah, I knew there was something that made me feel that way around that scene, and it reminded me of this thing, and I couldn't think why.
And it must be this, yeah. So,
like, whenever people talk about that, I always think of the trench run, right?
Yeah.
Where it's like the difference between Luke Skywalker hallucinating a voice and Luke Skywalker actively hearing a voice from a ghost is the fact that you hear the Force theme.
Nice. Yeah, thank you so much, man. Really appreciate it. This is a lot of fun as well.
No problem.